So, template-driven form validation. Pros, it's just like Angular 1.x. Almost identical. Now, some of them have changed. The names are slightly different. The basic functionality is still there. It's still HTML attribute-based validation that activate directives. These directives are like required, min length, max length, pattern, stuff like that. They're easy to use. And they're native to us because it's what we've been using. And if you've been using Angular 1.x, you should be pretty familiar with this at this point. Cons. HTML has business rules in it. We no longer have a separation of concerns. I no longer have a reusable HTML template. Who cares, right? Well, what we often find is that there's oftentimes where either by role or by, we'll have a physical address versus a mailing address, and we have two different validators, and then we're having to write a bunch of custom stuff to figure out how those are supposed to work and how they're supposed to be different. And often we create two different directives that have two different sets of HTML for us to maintain. So if we can actually back that up a little bit and say, hey, let's have our HTML template, and then let's have some validation rules that we can apply to it. It's also challenging to make template-driven conditional. I mean, it's not horrible, however, you have to write custom directives then. And then adding custom attributes to those and be able to handle all the different variances of what you want to be able to do. So it can be quite time-consuming. So when we look at template-driven form validation, this should look fairly similar. This is fairly familiar to you. If you look up here, we've got classic Bootstrap. So we've got a form, we've got a form group, we got a label, we got an input, so on and so forth. You know, form group, label, input, all the way down. So if we look over here, kind of hidden, is we've got required on it. We've got a custom one called validate email, which we'll look at later. We've got a min length one on here. Do we have anything else? Oh, we got another custom one called validate equal. Okay. So with this, as you see, I've got to have, with this template, I have these attributes added to it. Now there's some other ways I could hack this in. I could add these maybe after the template's actually been rendered and apply a directive to it. It's really not ideal. However, this is still a valid way of doing things. It works. It's easy to do. It's just not quite as extensible as what we might want. So how do we do this? Well, it's actually pretty simple. The main thing we're going to do is we're going to create a form. We're going to use no validate on the form. And then we're going to use the pound notation to create a local form variable. So the pound notation allows us to create variables inside of our HTML. So if we go back a slide here, you can see I have created a variable called pound registration form. Okay, so the variable now is just registration form, and that points to the ng form. So with that now, I can actually reference, and I'll show you some, this is kind of abbreviated code because I've got some other pieces in here that we're using those variables, and we'll look at that when we actually switch over to WebStorm. However, now I have a reference to the registration form. I've got one for, if I look over here, I've got pound username, I've got pound email, pound password, and where's the other one at here? Maybe I didn't create one for compare. Is it to the left? Okay. Oh. There it is. All right. Anyway, we'll move on from that. I'm not seeing it. So we use the pound notation. We create a local variable so we can access the form. Then we go ahead and create our controls. So again, we're just using form group and then a label, then an input. Very standard Bootstrap stuff. The main thing for this to work is ng model is required for the validators to work. If you take ng model off, I don't care what you put on it. None of it's going to fire. You ask it, the form's valid. Sure, it's valid. Nothing's filled out. Okay, one little gotcha with this. So you guys know what a banana box is? Anybody know what a banana box is? All right, that's a banana box right there. Okay, this little guy, because it looks like a box with two bananas in it, or maybe one banana. I don't know. If I squint a little bit, I can see a lot of things. That's our two-way binding. So again, if we come back over here, here's our ng model. If we take this off for, oh, we've actually, that's the problem. I've got some syntax errors in this here. Something got chopped off there. So there's my banana box for ng model, and it should be pointing actually to user.password, and then close off that. So, and then the last thing that we can do then is start to use local variables to create conditional validation messages. And yep.
I've seen this pound notation before. Is it a DOM thing, or is it an Angular thing, or what is it?
It's, I believe it's an Angular thing. I'm not sure if it is a DOM thing. Jeff, do you know?
Angular.
It's an Angular. That's what I thought. So in this case here, assuming I had one called C for control, again, this is just kind of abbreviated. So if I had an input control that was pound C equals my model, then I could do C dot, I'd show this, or actually hide this if C is not valid, or if C is pristine and we haven't submitted the form. So I'm using my variables. We'll actually look at a much more solid example of this. It's just kind of a very light deal here. So great. So let's actually look at some code. So what I've actually generated here is a base project using the Angular CLI. It's very just cut and dry. I've added created a components folder here, and I've created two components, one called model form and one called template form. So we're going to go look at the template form. And here we've got a little bit more code, and things are a little more laid out. So here I've declared my username and pointed to my model. And now what I want to do is I only want to show validation if, or hide the validation if the username is already valid, or if it's pristine and and it hasn't been submitted. So if I make any changes to it, or I submit it, or it's already valid, then don't show this message. Otherwise, I want to go ahead and let you know that the username is required and has a minimum of 5 characters. So pretty simple there for the validation. Again, this should all look pretty familiar to what you've seen in 1.x. It's not a big departure from what we've been working with for the last couple of years. So let's actually then slide over here and look at the template-driven form. So my LastPass likes to fill out my forms for me, so we'll remove some of those. Now, if I start to type here, I'm at 3, 4, now 5 characters. It goes ahead and drops off. I can get a little more custom with that and have 2 different messages, one for just being required and one for a min length one, which we'll actually look at on the model-based one. My email here, if we start to put in this, however, so this one's actually a little more robust. If we look here, I'm actually saying if there's hide this if there's not email errors and it's email's error required. So I can actually get down to specific error types that I want to trap for. So there's no argument for model versus template based on what I can actually screen for and be able to custom my validation messages for. So I've got that ability. Again, we've got the pristine and the submitted part. So come back over here. Once I go ahead and add the lost my deal, bug.com, and now our messages come back off. If I start to go backwards a little bit, now we're back to invalid. So all this is a regex expression, and it's a custom one that we built because we want to standardize how we do email addresses and not have the ability for a developer to go in and override what our standard is for email regex. So there is already a pattern-based validator provided by Angular 2. We've just in this case here we've created a custom one. The other one we have over here is on the password. So let's say I just type test and there we go. So it no longer matches. So this is using another custom validator, and I don't know if you noticed it had another property there called reverse, which actually places the validation on the other one. We'll dig into that a little bit, and also the source code's available if you'd like to check it out a little bit more. So again, pretty basic validation on what we can do here, and it doesn't really deviate much from what we already should know. All right, any questions so far? No? All right, so model-driven form validation. This is where really things start to change. The pros on this is that the HTML is independent from the business rules. I no longer have to put any attributes on this, and I can apply them as I see fit. It's easy to create conditional validation. Inside of my components controller, I can figure out whether or not, based off of either data that's loaded or roles that you're in or whatever business rules I want to use, I can have a very standardized way of, hey, these are the validators that I want to apply to this input form for this registration or whatever. The component defines how to validate, not the HTML. That HTML snippet actually becomes reusable, which means we can share it. Think about it, like I was saying earlier, an address class. We could actually then start to create a base address component and then extend it in TypeScript and then have a physical mailing address one that has different rules versus a mailing one. And there, let's say on the physical one, I go ahead and apply a Google address validator, the custom validator that I create that actually looks up the address and makes sure that I can geolocate it and fail it if it's not correct. So we can start to do things like that wouldn't really be quite as easy doing it in template-based. And if we did, we'd have two separate controls. So the cons, it's different. This is not what we're used to. There's some rules around how this works, and there's some things that they're little gotchas. A little more setup to add validators. It's not just, hey, I'm doing some markup. Hey, let's make this required. Let's put an email validator on this one. Probably this is the one that bit us the most. Lots of old and misinformation from prior release candidates. So literally we've gotten to the point when we're looking at Stack Overflow, we are watching for what the date is. If it's June 15th and before, ignore it because it's bad. It has bad data in it unless there's been an update to it. So that has actually led us down a lot of different rabbit holes that cost us a lot of time. So here are the two big gotchas. And we're going to talk about at the end here how we get around these. How do we resolve this? How do we keep these from biting us? So model-driven validation does not remove validators automatically when the control is hidden or removed. So on template-based, I can go ahead and say I have a condition. I have an ngIf, and if it doesn't meet this condition, then don't render the control. And if I don't render the control, then please don't validate it, right? And that makes sense. Not with model validation. It doesn't care. Now you're in charge of what the model is and what the validation model looks like. And so there's actually a really nice way to handle this. It's just not really easy or obvious, I should say, on how you might go about it. So we'll actually give you some code on that tonight on what you can do. And it's a nice, clean little directive that you can apply to it. And it'll watch for when it's initializing and being destroyed and add and remove itself from the form group. Nested components within a form don't automatically wire up. So this form that we're looking at over here, this is great. It's all one nice simple form, right? I'm not using any directives. I'm not doing anything special here. I don't have an address component that I've dropped down on here. If I did, and I just put in my address component, it would not automatically wire up the validation. It'll kind of do it. That's what the real slippery part is. It'll wire up to tell you that it's invalid when it's invalid. It won't tell you when it's been corrected. This is enough to drive a man crazy. I don't understand why this doesn't work. And we finally found some documentation on this and what you have to do. And we'll get into that a little bit as well. So let's see here. So model-driven form validation. Notice we're no longer declaring pound signs for form variables, and we're not doing it for our inputs as either here. If you look at it, they're actually very simple. There's not much to them. They're really the two things that are going on here. I got a form group. Notice I got square brackets around form group. Do you guys know why I'm doing that? Anybody?
Data binding.
Yeah, basically it's going to evaluate that string against the component before, instead of just attempting to just say it's a string. If I take the square brackets off of it, then it just assumes it's a string. So it's actually looking up the registration form, which is a variable on our component, and we'll see here in a minute that we've actually wired it up with a form group and form controls inside of it, and so on and so forth. The other one that we do here is, just take the first control, is we add form control name. In this case here, we're going to call it username. This needs to be inside of my form group. Okay, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. This can also be dynamic, by the way. We can assign the form controller name or form control name, putting square brackets around it, and assign it to a variable. And so our challenge with this is we actually have an application where when they said they wanted to add a new record, we asked two questions. Well, what's the data? You know, or let's say we're editing it. What's the data for it? One, and then two, what does the form look like? Because literally they would give us the contents of what we're rendering. So we would actually loop through over sections and then render, you know, hey, if it's of this type, then render a text box. Otherwise, render a text area, radio buttons, select box, so on and so forth. So we actually found out as well that you can make these 100% dynamic. None of this has to be hard-coded to a specific name. So those are really the, also the other thing you have to have on this, you also have to have ng model again for the validators to fire up and work. So, again, this is kind of what we just covered. We create a form, we put no validate, and we just add a form group pointing to our form group variable. We create controls. We put ng model on them. We put our form control name directive on them. Again, we can use local variables to create conditional validation messages if we wanted. I'm going to show you a better way. So actually, that is a mistake. I'll take that out of the slides. And the big thing here is we have to declare a form group. And then we got to start putting our validators in there. So what does that look like? What are form groups? Let's start with that. So form groups are really just grouping structures within a form. And they're comprised of either of two things, really, form controls and child form groups. So you can have form groups within form groups within form groups and so on and so forth. And then these can, you know, each one of those form groups can have controls in it. They're responsible for managing the form controls and collating the validation status of the child controls. Instead of having to loop through and say, look, I got 25 children, I got to figure out if they're all valid or not. The form group, those all get rolled up to the form group, and I can just ask the form group, are you valid? I can do that at my very top level form group, or if I want to validate section by section, I can do it there as well. So we've got a lot of options there. So in our case here, we're creating, here's our little form group variable. When we're talking about having in this case, this is actually a let, so it's private. Doesn't really work for form group great, because when we go to actually bind it, it's not available to the HTML. However, we create a person info object, assign it equal to a new form group, and first name is a new form control called Nate, so on and so forth. And this is actually just, I believe, this is actually assigning a default value to it. So this is not how most people do this. This is one way that you can do it. It's a very manual way of putting together your form groups. However, they've actually given you some tools to be able to make this a little bit easier, and you can do these a lot faster. Before we get there, let's talk about form controls. Form controls represent a single input control, and they encapsulate a field's value. The state, is it dirty? Is it valid? Is it pristine? You know, what errors are on it? To attach an HTML input for field to a form control, we use the form control name directive. So that's what this is right here. When I'm without this here, it doesn't know to go back over here. Let's say I have, you know, first name, or, you know, this was username. That's actually wiring up username here to username in the HTML. That's how it actually marries those two together. If you don't do that, it's not going to be in the validator, and your form's not going to be valid. You're going to run into problems. So we import what? How do we start setting this up? really the big three on this is we import, we need reactive form directives. That gets our ng model and our form controls and some stuff. I believe that, what's the name of that one again? It's the form control name. And then we bring in form builder and form group. We apply the reactive form directives to our component. And then on the constructor, we go ahead and bring in the form builder. So instead of having to do it this way and be very explicit in the declaration, form builder is actually going to short circuit a lot of this for us and make things a lot simpler for us to build. So here is well, out of the source code, this is the actual code for building our registration form. So in this case here, if you notice, we bring in our form builder. We call it FB for short. Okay, so we're saying our registration form equals this.fb.group, and then we go ahead and start adding these. The format is key colon and then an array, and inside that array, the first one is whatever the default value is, and then comma, another array, whatever validators we want to apply to it. So I do want to point out that here we're using validators compose, and we're actually adding the Angular 2 required validator and the Angular 2 min length validator. Again, we're setting a username is set with a default of nothing, and then we're adding 2 validators to it. If you remember back to the actual form, that's what we were doing in our validation. On email, we're using the required one and a custom validator called NP Validators email. Now this one here, we're not using validators compose. We actually found an issue with TypeScript. It's not so much an issue with TypeScript. It's an issue with the documentation or something. Not 100% sure how we were not able to get validators compose to recognize our email validator as being syntactically correct, even though it actually follows the Angular required validator verbatim. Something's not quite right, and we're okay with that. So one of the nice things about with TypeScript is we can actually kind of override the typings and go, we don't really need validator compose. We can go around it and just put both of these in an array, and it picks them both up. It's just not doing the type checking for us in this case. So it kind of gets back to this. Validators compose. The pros, it strongly enforces your validators. Con, strongly enforces your validators. We found it to be a little bit problematic. We're hoping that this gets cleaned up a little bit. Literally, when we're looking at the error message, it's saying that it's not able to take this type and apply it to this type, and they're identical. And it's kind of reminds me of C++ saying I'm not able to, assign the pointer to this pointer, sort of thing. And as we're all kind of like stark mad over it. All right, so let's look at some code on this. Any questions so far on models? All right, so we'll go ahead and look at the HTML over here. So it looks pretty similar to what we had before. Again, though, we got rid of the pound registration form variable, so we don't need a local variable anymore. We added our no validate, and again, all we really did here is we added our form group. And this registration form is actually pointing to, let's go look at the code here, this registration form, which is the one that I just showed you a second ago. So here's where, in our ng init, or on init, we're going ahead and we're creating this, using the form builder, we're going ahead and creating our form group, and now we're binding that up to our form over here. And then we're dropping down our control. So we've got our first form group, it's username. We go ahead and add our input. Again, everything's pretty much the same. The two things that are required here for us is the ng model with two-way binding for us, and our form control name, which is wiring up username here, again, to username here. Now, what happens if you don't do this? What happens if you delete this off of here? Angular will throw an error, because it was literally going to go look in your form group, bound to your form, and say, where is this control? I'm going to marry these two together. It's actually really nice. I think it's a very nice type check for us to make sure that we actually have all of our ducks in a row and not have to drive ourselves crazy attempting to figure out why our form's not validating. So it's some really nice feedback. So, and then we get into our validators. It looks just a little bit different. Now we're actually using our form group again, registration form, and then accessing the controls collection, accessing the username, and then a function called getError. GetError will tell me, true or false, do we have a required error on this control? And if we do, and it's not pristine and it's not been submitted, depending on what kind of rules you want around when validation shows, we want to then show that username is required. And if it has a get error on min length and that comes back true, then we want to have username must have a minimum of 5 characters. Nice and simple. So with that, also just note here, we've got our registration declared up here. It's a form group. We've got our users, our model, and submitted is a local variable here. So before we were actually keying off the form submitted before, and we're not doing that now. We're actually just manually setting, setting it to false on init, and when we actually go to submit it on register user, we're going ahead and setting that flag. There's a couple different ways you can do this. This tends to be the most common that we see, and it tends to be one of the easiest ones for us to manage. And so in our case here, if when we click our register user button, if it's valid, then we'll go ahead and send off an alert and let you know that it's actually correct. So pretty simple there. Any questions on the model?
So Jesse, if you have your template here with the error message, what if you have a separate controller that doesn't make username required? How's that going to respond here?
Okay, great. So I'm going to repeat your question so we have it with the video and we can hear this. So the question is that if I have, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, if I have another component that uses this HTML and I want it to not display this validation message, a couple of things that we can do. One is in that second component, I can actually just not put a required on it. And it's not ever going to then get a required deal on it. However, this is not what I would be doing for validation messages. If you look at this, like just for this hidden here, and I hate starting out with nots, and is it not this, and is it this or and not that, and like to actually even just to stand up here and describe it to you, it's like my head's swimming. This would be much better where it's actually some sort of function or property call that I can pass in the name of the field and what the what's the name of the validation that we're looking for. Is it required or this or that, and pass it in as a string, and I'd create a directive. So I can still drop that directive on here and still use that. However, the bigger point is that if I don't place the required rule on there, it's never going to show that deal. So does that answer your question?
Yep.
Awesome. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Your required min length, and then you have email. How did you define the email since that's custom?
Oh, okay. So email being custom. We'll actually cover that in just a second here. So the question is the custom validator for email. In this case here, it is a custom validator that we're going to take a look at. It's a really good example, and this is kind of the next step of this is how do we start writing custom validators? Because in the old days, we always had to write a directive, and that's not always true now. So